Hello, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of our VUS history information. All right, so basically, you can't talk about the beginning of American history without talking about why Europeans even came here in the first place. So, to begin, we have to go all the way back to the Age of Discovery. Many of you should remember at least some of this information from last year when you would have taken World History Part 2. All right. So, the main reason why people started going out and exploring was for economic reasons. 1453, Constantinople is taken over and now under control of the Ottoman Empire. You should remember that this place was the center of trade between Asia and Europe. It was a very rich trading city. It was a Christian city, so Europe had access to it. Once the Ottoman Turks took over, it then became a Muslim city. The doorway was closed unless you paid a really, really big entry fee if you were a Christian trader now. So the prices on all these luxury goods they were getting from Asia went up dramatically. So, what are we going to try and do now? What we're trying to do is we're going to see what we can do by going in a different direction. And that's where this gentleman comes in, Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. He was obsessed with sailing. He loved anything to do with it. He's going to be the guy who brings in a bunch of new technologies so that people can go out and hopefully find a new way to get to India and China to get the goods that they want in Europe. So what he's going to bring together is bring in these four basic technologies. One being the caravel, which is a larger ship. It's more robust. It can sail out into the open ocean a lot safer. They are going to, well, he is going to start having ships go out and start creating more accurate maps for people to travel by, like sailing along the African coast and having highly detailed maps about distances and, land formations, all of that. No more guesswork about, well, maybe we're about here. All right. The compass is going to be an invention that is now used to help with directional, concepts when you are traveling. All right. And the astrolabe, which is an instrument that uses the stars and planets in the sky to help you find your location on the map when you're at sea, because, if you're in the middle of the ocean, you can't see any land. So you need something to help you figure out where your position is. All right. 1492. This is like one of the most important years that in human history. Now, a lot of people have this urban myth that everybody was uneducated at this time and thought the world was flat. People who were educated, so like the richer people, like middle class on up, they understood that the world was round. They just did not know how big the world actually was. So, to put that into perspective, take a globe and cut into it like a cake, like you're cutting a slice out of it. But that slice that you're cutting out of the globe is the piece of North America and South America. And you take that and get rid of it, and then you just smush the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans together. That's what people thought the world was. They thought it was just one gigantic ocean that if you sailed west from Europe, you would immediately go straight across this big, big ocean to Asia. They had no idea the Americas were there. All right. And this, of course, is Christopher Columbus that we're going to be talking about next. An Italian sailor sailing for Spain, and he wanted to see if there's a way to go west to get to India. And yeah, so he's given three ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and they go west. And he finds what he thinks is the islands off the coast of India, which of course now we know was, the Caribbean islands. So he's going to make 4 voyages during his time to the Indies, and calls the people there Indians, thinking he's in India, when in fact he's in the New World, the Americas. But he is going to discover modern day Cuba, Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, and he does get to Central America, like Belize. Uh, and he claims it all for Spain, even though there's already people living there. Now, in North America, England is going to want to start getting involved. So they're going to send out people of their own. And, well, this right here shows some of the early areas where exploration would happen for the English. The mid-Atlantic area, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. You're going to get New England like Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. All right. Now, this guy, Giovanni Cabot, or John Cabot as the English called him, he is basically credited with discovering continental North America in 1497 while sailing for Henry VII of England. All right, he basically finds Canada. So the English are getting involved. Now the Dutch are wanting to get involved, the people of Holland. So they hire this guy named Henry Hudson, and in 1609, he is going to try and find a way to go around North America, called the Northwest Passage, but instead, he ends up finding the Hudson River. And this Hudson River, if any of you know where that is right in it. One end of it is in New York Harbor. So he is actually given credit for discovering the modern day location of New York City. And when he found this location, he was like, oh my God, this place is excellent. You could sail these big ships that they were using right up to the land because of how deep the water was. It was excellent harbor space for ships. You didn't have to load into small boats off the coast and then row into shore. You could just sail the big boat right on up. And he would notice that there is a lot of rich farmland that could be used, a lot of major forests that could be used for timber. And basically, it's like he goes back to the Dutch people and he's like, this place is amazing. You need to start sending people there to settle now, like before anybody else gets there. And they did. But just to tie things up with Henry Hudson, in a voyage in 1610 to 1611, he is basically going to suffer a mutiny where his crew rebels against him. He is going to die after his crew mutinies and puts him, his son, and 7 other loyal crew members adrift in a small lifeboat in the middle of Hudson Bay, which is that big body of water that's in Canada. And they die from exposure and cold and all of that. So great way for him to end, right? Now, the Dutch colonies, that area that he discovered, modern-day New York City, that region is now going to be called New Netherland, after the Netherlands where the Dutch people are from. All right? Their first settlement was a fur trading post. They wanted furs. They wanted the fur of bear, deer, otter, beavers, all these animals that are a little more rare or don't exist in Europe. So the guy who would be the governor of New Netherland, he would buy Manhattan Island from the native people who live there, and he would call this settlement New Amsterdam. So New Amsterdam is actually the original name for New York City, named after Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands in Europe. Now, what kind of price do you think that is going to be paid for Manhattan? Whatever you said, I'm sure it's way too high. So the purchase was basically $1,200 in like modern day money worth of goods. Just $1,200 is all they paid for the island. The Lenape people, they had no concept of money. Because they was like communal use of the land. So they didn't understand that they were giving up their rights to the land that they lived on. So yeah, the Dutch screwed them out of their land. All right, now to put some more things in perspective, this is how close the British and the Dutch colonies were in the first big chunk of the 1600s. Considering how close they are, do you imagine that there's going to be conflict at some point between them? If you thought yes, you would be correct. All right. So, one other detail you need to know, a lot of Dutch people didn't actually want to go to the colony of New Amsterdam. So they actually had to go to other countries, the people who were like funding voyages and settlements. They had to go to other countries to get people to actually go there and work the colonies for them. So yeah, there was a very wide variety of people. There were French people, English people, Dutch people, Germans. There were, you know, probably some Italians and Spanish mixed in there, Jewish people possibly, and they had a very large variety there. So, and that's going to play into like the British colonial system, where there's always going to be more of a variety of ethnic groups in those middle colonies like New York and New Jersey. All right. Now, this guy right here would be the last governor for the Dutch in New Amsterdam. He was an awful governor. He made laws that angered the colonists. He did not believe in tolerance. If you didn't believe what he did, he would basically get rid of you, like push you out of the colony, banish you type stuff. So the people were very unhappy with him, with Stuyvesant. And that is going to lead to, in 1664, when the British attack the colony to take over, the colonists are just like, you know what? Take it. Let's see if you do a better job. So that is when New Amsterdam becomes New York, named after the Duke of York in England. All right. So now let's take a little bit of a look at the southern colonies. That's basically from Maryland on down to Georgia. Florida was owned by the Spanish at this time. They don't become a part of like America until there is an America. So after 1780. All right. An important fact to know about the colony of Maryland, it actually became a safe haven for Catholic people to go to. You don't really think about Catholics during colonial times, but there was actually a decent portion of the population in Maryland who was Catholic. Everybody else was pretty much some version of Protestant, like Lutherans and Baptists and Calvinists and what have you. All right. Can't talk about colonies without talking about the Roanoke colony, the lost colony, where, it was founded in 1586. The leader went back to England to get more people and supplies, and when he came back the whole place was abandoned. And there was no clue as to what happened to the colonists except for a word carved into a tree. And the word carved into a tree was Croatoan. And it has baffled historians for a very long time until actually this year, 2020. And that is that historians and archaeologists have found enough evidence where they can pretty safely state that the local Croatoan tribe of Native Americans actually absorbed the colonists into their population, and they became a part of the tribe. They intermarried into the tribe, and their descendants of these colonists were actually in the native population. All right, and that actually lines up with some legends about the lost colony, because there had been theories that and sightings of lighter skinned, blue-eyed Indians or Native Americans, whichever you want to call them, in the area. So that also helps give prudence to the idea that they were absorbed into the local native population, which is now being supported by historians and scholarly sources along with archaeological evidence. So the mystery is basically solved after, let's see, that would be 400 and almost 440 years. 433 years, basically. All right, but the first permanent English settlement in North America, the first one to survive, is Jamestown. Established by the Virginia Company of London in 1607, right here in Virginia, right there on the Chesapeake coast. All right, and the hardships of the settlers when they first got there. First off, it's because they built their settlement in a swampy area, so not exactly good for drinking water and for cooking. And they would lack a lot of the skills necessary to provide for themselves, such as farming. A lot of these guys were rich dudes who were trying to just be adventurers, and guys who were just, they were good diggers because they were there to dig and look for gold. So a lot of people would die of starvation and disease because they didn't know what they were doing at first. And it's something like 3 out of every 4 men from the first ship that got there died. All right? But it's all going to start turning around slowly when 2 supply ships arrive along with more people, more men, and they started to get a redirection towards being self-sufficient by farming and things like that to survive. And big part of it is due to the efforts of this man right here, Captain John Smith. He would become the leader of the colony, at least for a short time. He would initiate trade with the local Powhatan native tribes, led by Chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. And he had a rule that I really like, and it's basically, he who will not work will not eat. So basically, you don't do your job, you're not getting fed that day. Now, he does get injured and have to go back to England. He was injured in an explosion. There was some type of mishap with some gunpowder, and he got injured in the process. Like, he didn't lose an arm or a leg or anything, but the injury was bad enough where he had to leave the colony and go back to England, and he lived out the rest of his life there. He never returned. Though Pocahontas did actually meet up with him like one time when she was in England before she died there. All right, trade with the local Powhatans. The Powhatan would trade food, furs, because those were a commodity that the English wanted, as well as leather to the English. And the English would trade them tools, pots, even guns at one point, and a lot of other like glass and iron and steel implements, things that they did not have access to because the Powhatan and all Native American peoples at this time, they pretty much only had access to wood and rock and leather. And that was as advanced as their technology got. Now, can't talk about Jamestown without talking about Pocahontas a little bit. Pocahontas, she was basically a princess of the Powhatan people, and she wanted to push for the English and the natives living in harmony. And this would begin with a friendship that she would develop with the colonists and helping them to survive, by giving them food so that they didn't starve to death in the winter. And yes, the act of her saving Captain John Smith's life did happen, but it is actually not, he wasn't going to actually be executed. What it turns out is that it was a ceremony where basically the Powhatan tribe was adopting him into the tribe, and the act of the execution of like clubbing his head to death and crushing it was actually symbolizing the death of his old life, and Pocahontas like covering him to like take away the like to save his life was her basically bringing him into his new life, and she technically you could say was kind of like an adopted mother to him in the tribe. So they actually became like family in an adopted sort of way. And that is actually what the whole deal actually is. It is a symbol of the death of his old life and the birth into his new life as part of the tribe as an adopted son. All right, moving on. The Powhatans would actually introduce the English colonists to the cash crops, big time moneymakers of corn and tobacco. Now, the colonists, there would be some growing conflict between the two groups. The colonists began to steal and to try and intimidate and push the natives around. The Powhatans, seeing this new trend happening, would see that the English, they're here to stay. They're not going to leave. So they're just going to keep taking and taking, and this is going to lead to conflict that will eventually just, it'll go across the entire continent of what you would call the Indian Wars. Basically, it would go through the end of the 1800s. So a 250 plus year long conflict of various native tribes versus colonialism, essentially. The natives, they would lose their traditional territories, their homelands. They would fall victim to diseases, especially smallpox, which was highly contagious and highly deadly to the natives of North America and Central America and South America. All right. Now, switching gears a little bit, there were trading posts all along the African coast, trading slaves, gold, and other products, right? This is going to play a role in North American history, obviously. And that is the fact that we're going to have something called the Columbian Exchange. The exchange of products and resources between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, between the New World, North and South America, and the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So an example would be like how tobacco is going to the New World, and tobacco is going to the Old World, and horses are going to the New World. The Spanish were the first to introduce horses to the Americas. All right, so here is a map showing the exchange of goods. Who would you say, looking at this, got the better end of the exchange? If you said the Old World, like Europe and Africa, you'd be correct, because the Americas, they kind of got messed up a bit because of this right over here. All of these diseases would come over to the New World and decimate the populations of the native people in North, Central, and South America. Now, we would also get potatoes from the New World that would become a staple part of the food in the Old World, like in Europe. Think the Irish potato famine. All right. Now, horses and cattle would be a huge lifestyle change for the American Indians. Think the tribes of the Great Plains, like that stereotypical look of the Indian warrior riding on his horse, like into battle or on a buffalo hunt. So it would completely transform the way that certain tribes in North America do anything. They would evolve their way of life around the horse. And cattle would eventually be used to push out and decimate the populations of the native buffalo herds to make room for cattle ranches and these big farms of producing beef. All right, so back to the diseases. Diseases like smallpox killed many American Indians. It would basically Think of barnacles on the bottom of a boat, those crusty things. That's kind of what smallpox looks like on a person. And it would be very painful. It would slowly kill them, and it was contagious. And it would just flood through the populations. Now, somewhere around 90% of the entire native population of North and South America would end up dying as a result of disease. So, some examples. Mexico, we believe, had a population of around 25 million people in 1500 before Cortez and other Spanish really got there. And 130 years later, they're down 94% to around 1 million people that are native born. That is significant population loss. The island of Hispaniola, the first place where Columbus visited, they had a population of about 250,000 people, and in 46 years, that's one lifetime, less than a lifetime, they dropped 99.8% to 500 native people. That is decimation of the native population. Now, this meant that the native people would not be able to serve as slaves in the New World like Columbus had originally hoped. So this is actually when the African slave trade is going to begin. And this, yes, I know is a very touchy subject, but it's one that has to be talked about when we are speaking about, history in the Americas. Now, the first Africans would be brought to the North American colonies in 1619 to work on tobacco plantations at Jamestown. This happened, it was a Portuguese? Yeah, it was a Portuguese slave ship that brought them to Jamestown. And something to keep in mind, the biggest buyer of slaves during the African slave trade was actually the Caribbean islands and South America for the sugar plantations. There was a very, very big need of labor because that's a very labor intensive cash crop. All right. Now, the number of slaves that actually came across the ocean to the New World, we don't have a real number. We don't know how many there were. A lot of people believe that somewhere between 10 to 15 million were forcefully moved to North and South America. The vast majority of them went to South America and the Caribbean to the sugar plantations, but somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 actually came to what would become the United States. So the British colonies. Right. Now, slavery was based on race, but also disease played a role in this. And it's because Africa and Europe have a centuries, if not millennia long history of interaction with each other. They're more used to each other's diseases than the natives of the Americas would be. So there is some immunity to them. So like smallpox and measles and things like that aren't going to affect African slaves nearly as much as they did the native populations of the Americas. That's a big part of why the Africans would be bought as slaves. Right. So this increased demand for slaves due to the expansion of the colonies would actually give rise to a very profitable business for West African kingdoms, the kingdoms along the west coast of Africa, leading to a number of African empires who would thrive. They would be very, very, what's the word? They would do very, very well financially with the slave trade. These kingdoms, they would become very militaristic, and they would be in constant warfare with their neighbors and other tribes and kingdoms that are inland in Africa, where their job was basically go out, capture people, and sell them to the Europeans. They were selling each other into slavery to the Europeans in their colonies. right? And that voyage from Africa to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage. All right. Now, for slave ships to have maximum capacity, every inch of storage space was used. So slaves, they would be stacked like they were just, piles of wood. Think if you ever been to a lumber yard or at Lowe's or Home Depot and you go into the wood lumber section and you just see the stacks and stacks of like 2x4s, people were piled into these slave ships like that. And each person would have basically just as much room as they would have if they were laying in a coffin that was closed. So you got to imagine what this would be like. You're in a cramped space, you're chained in place, you can barely move. It's hot, it's humid from all the moisture in the air from people breathing. It stinks because they weren't allowed to, get up and go to the bathroom. They basically had to mess on themselves while they were laying there. And there would be people dying in these situations. So then you got the smell of death as well mixed in. And yeah, it was just atrocious, awful conditions for any person to be in. Now, when there even was food and water, it was not of great quality. A lot of people would fall sick. A number of people would attempt committing suicide, like jumping overboard if they managed to get loose. When people got sick, sometimes they were just thrown overboard. If the ship got low on food and water, sometimes the weakest and sickliest of these slaves would just be thrown overboard to help conserve food and water. And it is estimated during the 6 to 10 week trip, 14 to 20% may have died in transit from moving from Africa to the Americas, which would add an additional 4 to 5 million people that were taken out of Africa but never made it to the Americas. So it's closer to 15 to 20 million people were taken from Africa, but only 10 to 15 actually made it. Yep. So the Middle Passage was part of what is called the triangular trade pattern, which is basically we have Americas, Europe, and Africa. From Europe to Africa, we have luxury goods. So things that have been manufactured that people in the rulers in Africa want, the people of power want. And they in turn are giving slaves and gold to the Europeans, who are then taking the slaves and gold to the Americas, well, taking at least the slaves there to work in the fields and, getting the raw materials that they are producing there. And they are then in turn sending those raw materials to Europe to be processed into luxury goods to be sold. All right, that is where we're ending today. And when we come back, we will look at more about the colonies themselves and the populations that made up the different areas of the British colonies.